be divided. The people united will never be divided. Come on, the people united will never be divided. The people united will never be divided. The people united will never be divided. The people. Rights, human needs. Human rights, human needs. RVA democracy. Human rights, human needs. RVA democracy. Human rights. This is what democracy looks like. Over time. This is what democracy looks like. Show me what it looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like.
This is more relevant. This is what democracy looks like. It's not just a national movement about national economic issues.
Show me what democracy looks like.
We got sold out.
X got failed out.
We got sold out.
X got failed out.
We got sold out.
Thanks got bailed 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 out.
We got sold out. We got sold out. We got sold out. We got sold out.
Thanks got bailed out.
We got sold out.
X got failed out.
We got sold out.
Thanks got bailed out.
We got sold out.
I never heard of that aggression.
Human rights, human needs, RVA democracy. 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 Human rights.
Goes to fund this organization.
Goes to fund this organization.
In 2009, the people raised $25 million.
$25 million.
This money is supposed to go towards arts and education.
Arts and education.
Arts and education for who?
Arts and education for who?
When 75%
of
Richmond public school students live below the poverty line. We are cutting $15 million to Richmond's public schools. Why are we paying for a building most of us can't afford to go to? We're going left. Time that these 33 workers received an order of deportation instead of their final paychecks. Ah! The United States has 5% of the world's population, but it has almost a quarter of the world's prisoners. 7.2 million people and growing are on probation, in jails, prison, or on parole. 3.2% of all U.S. adult residents, 1 in every 31 adults is in prison or in one of those facilities in some sort of restraint. It costs an average of $30,000 a year to incarcerate an inmate in the prisons in Richmond, Virginia. It costs $3 million to execute someone. Yeah. The Virginia Department of Corrections has an annual budget exceeding $1 billion. The state's largest agency with more than 13,759 employees.
Insane.
Yeah, it is insane. We have more people in prison than any other nation in the world.
Fuck that!
60% of offenders in local jails were racial or ethnic minorities, a statistic that has not changed in the past decade. Nearly 4.5% of black men, nearly 2% of Hispanic men, and only 0.7% of white men nationwide were in jails or in prison.
One of them is my mom.
Shame. Most for nonviolent crime.
Yeah, by incarcerating people for minor violations and petty drug offenses, we are draining our resources of human capital. These nonviolent criminals are responding to a society that has ostracized them based on race, gender, and class, etc. When struggling to pay bills, send your kids to college, or simply bring food home, we resort to simple acts of survival. Most people incarcerated are caring individuals that have no desire for violence towards a community that allows everyone a fair voice and reciprocates with care and love. Instead, we see an economic system exploiting political influence to incarcerate people for profit. If we live in a society that was truly just, the prison industrial complex would not need to exist.
That's right.
Let's move.
Mid-January.
Mid-January.
That's shorter, that's better. The General Assembly will meet.
The General Assembly will meet.
And they will start to work.
And they will start to work.
To implement.
The
state budget.
The state budget.
That Governor McDonald.
That Governor McDonald.
Will announce. On December 19th.
On December 19th.
This, by state law. The budget has to be balanced.
The budget has to be balanced.
So guess whose backs?
The
governor wants to balance the budget on.
The governor wants to balance the budget on.
He wants to lay off state workers.
He wants to lay off state workers.
Freeze state worker salaries.
Freeze state worker salaries.
Reduce state worker pensions.
Reduce state worker pensions.
Reduce aid to the cities.
Reduce aid to the cities.
Reduce support for public education.
Reduce support for public education.
But he will not. Cut the budget. For the prisons. He will not. Cut the budget. For the police. He won't even close down. The one state agency. That promotes state trade. With a particular country. And that is. The Virginia Israel Advisory Board. They won't even cut. The state money that goes to support. The cleaning up. Of the Robert E. Lee statue on Monument Avenue. We say no. Don't balance the budget. On the backs of Virginia's workers. About January 14th. For the Virginia People's Assembly. March back here. In the hundreds. Enforce that demand.
I'm just going to begin. My name is Jonathan Lewis. I'm a student at VCU. I major in environmental studies and business. I am not against banks. Banks were made to save our money and help it grow. And they have worked well in the past in the interest of the consumer. That's been hard recently due to the creation of the plutocracy that has formed by these banks turning into corporate entities by absorbing all these other smaller independent banks that were just isolated to individual states. But I'm not against corporations either. They have the right to make the money they want. It's natural selection. It's survival of the fittest. They have the right to make the money they make as long as they abide by the principles of the marketing concept, which includes focusing on consumer wants and needs to distinguish products from competitors' offerings, and integrating all the organization's activities to satisfy these wants, and most importantly, achieving the organization's long-term goals by satisfying customer wants and needs legally and responsibly. So why are we here? Because they are not saving our money, they are not meeting our wants and needs, and they are not doing business legally and responsibly.
Yep.
So you may be, excuse me, so you may be asking, how did this all happen? It happened by the deregulation of banks in the past 3 decades, starting in the 1980s through the early 2000s.
Correct.
Fact check.
Yeah. But it's all because of the Great Depression and the regulations that were instituted post-Great Depression to help control the banking system and stop the reckless investing and spending of people's money.
Correct.
So that's where you get the Glass-Steagall Act, which was implemented in 1933. Passed in 1933 in response to the Great Depression, the Glass-Steagall Act separated investment, insurance, and commercial banking activities. Prior to the Great Depression, banks were able to use depositors' money to buy stocks as well as other investment activities. Banks became greedy, taking part in increasingly risky activities. When the stock market crashed in 1929, so did the banks because much of their depositors' money was invested in stocks. So you have this period of regulation up pretty much until the 1960s. And it was great. Banks were doing their job. There were thousands of individual banks. About, let me check real quick. There was about
12,000.
Yeah, 12 to 13,000 individual banks in the United States. But that all started to dissipate as soon as deregulation began in the 1980s.
Bring it back.
Starting with the Depository Institutions Deregulation and Monetary Control Act of 1980. This act invalidated all limitations on the rates of interest which are payable on depositor-owned accounts. It also authorized the transaction of these interest-bearing accounts. Hence, banks selling off people's mortgages to investment firms so they don't have to wait for the mortgages to mature over the life of the mortgage. Before the deregulation, mortgages were amortized, meaning they paid individual installments over the life of the loan, which is usually 30 years. And after that, these banks would just sell them off without thinking of the backlash or exactly who was qualified to get these loans in the first place. So then came the mortgage crisis, which happened mostly due to the biggest piece of deregulation financially in our history, which was the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. Widely accepted as the main cause of the financial crisis, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act tore down all barriers between investment firms, commercial banks, and insurance companies, allowing them to merge and take part in each other's business practices. It also limited private protections against the disclosure of your personal financial information. This act repealed what was left of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which really protected the consumers. So you may be asking, what exactly were the activities that these banks were doing that was so illegal and so wrong? Mostly it was this predatory lending, where they would mislead just about anybody they could who wanted a mortgage into getting a mortgage and then ending up getting ridiculous balloon payments which they could have no possibility of affording, and then end up defaulting on the mortgages. And this happened on a mass scale, hence the whole mortgage crisis.
Hello, excuse me. Hello.
But just to give you an example of some of these acts.
Mic check.
Mic check.
We're not going anywhere. We're not going anywhere.
I'm just going to skip forward to some of the grievances that we have with Bank of America. Bank of America hasn't changed its fraudulent practice since the financial crisis. They are failing to disclose essential information to borrowers, misleading them into signing a mortgage they are unable to pay off. Bank of America has also manipulated person financial information to justify doing all these mortgages. In recent years, Bank of America was accused of raising interest rates for absolutely no reason, no justifiable reason. This isn't quite as major. Like I said, they have the right to make their money, but it's absolutely ridiculous when Bank of America, who owns over $72 trillion in derivatives bets, just is greedy enough to charge its constituents whatever they think is, within their legal right. Bank of America claimed to its shareholders and customers that Bank of America Merrill Lynch merger was one of the steadily foundation. However, within the first quarter of acquisition of Bank of America, it posted a $15.4 billion loss. So once again, lying to the constituents and basically trying to get as much money as possible through the derivatives market that Merrill Lynch had such a great stake in. And this is the biggest gripe, the greatest grievance I have with Bank of America.
Tell it.
Bank of America has moved $75 trillion in derivatives bets from Merrill Lynch to a subsidiary insured by the FDIC, which basically means they're taking that $75 trillion in debt and moving it and placing the burden on people's savings accounts. Because the FDIC was put in place to insure up to $200,000 of your savings. So basically, Bank of America said, screw that. If these derivatives bets turn toxic, we're taking your money to pay off our debts. $75 trillion of it. And also, I'm sure you're all familiar with the TARP bailout. The $640 million was allocated to the top 5 financial institutions in this country, banks and investing firms. Well, since then, there's been over $7 trillion in unsupervised loans given out to these same financial institutions. $1.2 trillion going to Bank of America alone. And Merrill Lynch, now part of Bank of America, gave 22 times more bailout money to any other single company to bonus executives. Google indexed that $3.6 billion was given an executive directly from the bailout.
Hang on high.
So you're asking, like, what exactly can we do about this?
Hang on high.
We must act. Woo! No legislation and know what as well as who you are voting for. For example, Elizabeth Warren, who is now running for senator of Massachusetts, who is trying to establish a consumer watchdog agency, which would protect people from these predatory loans and these predatory lending practices. Move money out of the banks and into a credit union.
That's right.
But not all banks are bad. Do your research. Basically, TARP fund recipients are guilty as charged. So keep away from Citibank, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, all those investment firms.
Wells Fargo.
And I think most importantly, share what you know. Help create a more educated society and transparent marketplace. Knowledge is power. Don't let them take advantage of you. We are the fuel for their business. They rely on us for the money they make. They've been guzzling our money and will continue to until we either cut off their fuel supply or convict them of their crimes and we install sensible and fair regulation. That's it.